A very good afternoon, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Taisha, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. Welcome to this afternoon's ISAS-CPR panel discussion on the Clean India Mission, Challenges and Prospects. To start the proceedings, it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. First, Dr. Dipinder S Randhawa, Senior Research Fellow at ISAS-NUS. Next, we have Mr. Shubhagato Dasgupta, Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, India, Director, Scaling City Institutions for India Sanitation Initiatives, and Honorary Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Next, we have Ms. Maitreyee Mukherjee, PhD candidate at the LKY School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And finally, chairing the panel discussion would be Professor Subrata Mitra, Director and Visiting Research Professor at ISAS-NUS. I will now hand over the session to Professor Mitra. Professor, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for moving from 6th floor to the 9th at the shortest of short notices. I suspect that might have somehow affected the size of the audience. I have already alerted the members of the panel that the size of audience is no reflection on the seriousness of the issue that we are about to discuss. On the face of it, it looks like a simple matter. And how often have we been told in India, cleanliness is godliness and stuff like that. But the fact remains that 1 billion people worldwide today still practice open defecation. India alone has an estimated 600 million people defecating openly, and according to the study of the United Nations, India accounts for more open defecators than any other country in the world. I mean, that is a sordid statistics, and I'll not take you into the details, but there is a lot more. The point is, why did it take India so long to wake up to this scandal? And why is it that Indians, it's a largely Hindu population, non-Hindus of India mostly are converts from Hinduism, and when you change your gods, you don't necessarily change your values, so the core values remain. You can't find another country which is more obsessed with the idea of pollution. And yet, these strictures about pollution do not translate into filth outside. I mean, that's the kind of paradox we have all grown up with. And suddenly, there's a wake-up call, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan of the Prime Minister, and that more or less brings us here. The question now would be, Swachh Bharat is Prime Minister Modi's idea. Why is it also an ISAS idea? Or why is ISAS, which is the think tank of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Industry, and a research institute of NUS, concerned with Swachh Bharat? The point is, this institute is here not just because South Asia is there, but because Singapore is here. Our job is to connect Singapore to contemporary South Asia and contemporary South Asia to Singapore. If for the Prime Minister of India, like ACTist, Swachh Bharat or Clean India is a major program and a policy initiative, then it would be a responsibility of ISAS also to look at it seriously. Now, what does it mean to look at such a program seriously? Ladies and gentlemen, the open defecator makes a choice either to defecate openly or not. So what is the rationality that underpins this simple decision? The moment you ask the question that way, you realize that it is a far more complex issue than one thinks. And that is why for ISAS, which is not only a think tank given to policy analysis, but also a research institute given to deeper research, I consider it a major research problem, which belongs to the generic category of public service delivery. And that is increasingly an important part of state, society, and governance, which is one of our three main concentrations. The other two are trade and industry and economy, and foreign policy and security. We, of course, have given ourselves a little more to do because we don't have enough to do. So we are looking at the Indian Ocean in terms of maritime governance, and of course we look at the South Asian diaspora every second year. We have a major convention here. So that's the agenda of ISAS. I've more or less now explained to you why this issue is an integral part of our research agenda. Let me tell you a little more, because I have looked at this problem closely, particularly when I was invited to give a talk on public service delivery in Bangladesh. 1971, when I was a student in Delhi at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the war had broken out in East Pakistan, we were raising bits of money to help out, and Bangladesh is born. But after that, there was sort of negative noises coming out from the United States, particularly from the Secretary of State, who are saying Bangladesh, because the United States had sort of voted on the wrong side, it's a basket case, it will be flushed out to the Bay of Bengal. That's the kind of cachet with which Bangladesh comes to be. And I discovered in Bangladesh statistics which I have got here today. In 2003, open defecation in Bangladesh was 42%, and today it has gotten to just 1% of its 166 million population. Whereas when it comes to India, you still have only 42% of rural households having access to toilet, which means a majority do it in the open. And when you look at Bangladesh, the statistics are absolutely mind-boggling. Then the question is, how could Bangladesh do it? Here, again, one learns that Bangladesh made it a major part of their development program, and 25% of the country's overall development budget went into this campaign against open defecation. And they have gone on to achieve these superb results to change the brand recognition of Bangladesh. When it comes to the brand recognition of India, of course, if you are taking a train from any major station in India, you wouldn't want to look out for the first 10-15 minutes. Or if the train is approaching the next major station, you wouldn't want to look out, because that is the face of India that you don't want to project. Now, why does it matter besides hurting the pride that Indians have in themselves? Ladies and gentlemen, if you are wanting to invest money in a country and you're looking at its infrastructure, the way it looks, the way it presents itself, certainly becomes a very, very important indicator. A clean and orderly place is a place where you would want to put your money. So it's not just a question of culture or a question of the pride one has in the country, but it is also worth the money that goes into it in terms of the attractiveness of a country. And beyond that, one also has issues, and some of it will be surfacing today in our discussion, of indirect costs to the exchequer, such as terrific epidemics, disease, and negative effect on longevity, working population, and so on. I would not want to go into further details except one more or two more points. I talked about the decision to do it one way or another. I was trained in rational choice theory, and individual reasoning is one of my major heuristic devices when it comes to explaining. When it comes to the Clean India campaign, the government of India has now made a major discovery that it's not just an individual decision. This is where the whole idea of throwing money at individuals to build their toilets, giving subsidies, has probably found its limitations, and they are now moving towards an idea which was tested and found to be very successful in Bangladesh. It's called the community-led total sanitation approach, where you don't go at it individually, but go at it in terms of the community, in terms of the family, and in terms of larger campaigns. Of course, Bangladesh has a further advantage of not just a campaign culture, an NGO culture, which India doesn't quite have. So when you put these things together, you are beginning to see new research problems analyzing human behavior and human incentives and institutional structure within which action can be taken. Now a final point. India's general statistics is abysmal, but guess which states of India have the best results? They are Sikkim, 98.2%, absence of open defecation, Kerala, 97.6%, and Mizoram, 96.2%. Now, these are not necessarily very rich states, and at least two of them have problems of insurgency and other problems of governance. In spite of that, in this particular indicator, they are shining examples. So if you are working on Indian politics or federalism, once again, another outlier and another research problem. As you can see, here is a problem, a first-class problem for proper research, and I've been chatting with our panelists so that when the presentations are over, they will think through their presentations, and we have a chance of seeing them in a written form as ISAS Insights. I would also strongly encourage the audience to think along. And this is what I have arranged with our speakers. Each speaker takes 15 to 20 minutes for the presentation, and I'll immediately take one or two questions if they're very specific, factual, and focused on the paper itself. However, you may have questions which are comparative, or you might want to draw on all the three papers. Then please hold those questions towards the end, because when the three presentations are over, we'll have a chance to have a general discussion. So with these introductory remarks and the rules of the game and rules of transaction, I would now be calling on Dr. Randhawa to present his paper. Dipinder, thank you. I will move over.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mitra. You've actually said given already about half of my speech and the data. I'm going to start with a caveat. It was only in July this year, late July, I was checking up the dates, actually, that I first came across the notion of not Swachh Bharat. Of course, that's been around. But I first started reading something which went beyond newspapers, and this was in the context of looking for, I started doing some initial work on a particular behavioral economics construct, the notion of nudges. And sanitation, which we've all grown up, I mean, those of us who have grown up in India, you see the problems are endemic right through, and right from kindergarten, you've been told the importance of hand washing and Mahatma Gandhi's words, which ring a very different manner today. So I'm going to start with the caveat. I'm sitting next to somebody whose work I've been reading and sourcing extensively, Professor Shubhagato Dasgupta, and much of the data that he's actually worked on those multilateral studies. So I feel like a bit of an interloper just sitting on this panel as well. My effort is going to be basically just to lay out, to focus on two issues. One is the impact of sanitation, particularly the manifestations of open defecation on children's health, and consequently the impact on society at large. And secondly, the economic costs. I'm not going to barely touch upon the policy issues. I don't think I'm equipped to talk about those aside from loose generalities. So if you look at the numbers, what is really striking about India is despite the fact that incomes have been rising, there have been remarkable achievements in science and technology, people going up in space, in the advanced education, yet children in India tend to be amongst the most malnourished and stunted and wasted across the world. Stunting basically means that a child is too short for his or her height. And this has nothing to do with aesthetics. It's basically because of persistent infections, microbial infections that you suffer from, and nutritional deficiencies that leave you underweight. And this is a sight we've all seen, encountered in various sites. Wasting is where you weigh too little for you, you're underweight. And that's a reflection of even more severe. So stunting takes place till the age of 2, and the reason why its consequences are nothing short of devastating is we know for a fact today in the literature that if you don't get enough nourishment till the age of 2, you are essentially impaired for life. Your cognitive abilities are impaired, your physical development is going to be impaired, and it's extremely difficult to catch up later in life. So you start off with a huge handicap. Wasting is essentially, as I mentioned, means you weigh too little for your cohort. And that, again, the consequences are severe nutritional deficiencies and disease. And wasting till the age of 5 is a predictor of infant mortality as well, or mortality at a young age. And those numbers, while the overall infant mortality rate in India has come down significantly, mortality amongst the low-income cohort remains a very high number. What is also nothing short of staggering again is the sheer scale of numbers. 65 million children in India suffer from malnutrition in some form or the other. And the reason why India is an outlier is despite improvements, substantial improvements in nutritional intake, in the availability of food, in access to food as well, children remain effectively malnourished. And I'll explain in a moment what this means. Why is this a consequence? The repercussions, again, spread far beyond the immediate family. I'm doing some related work on skills development, and one of the things which is very frustrating when you're looking at, I spent some time at the industrial training institutes, and one of the things that you realize is these kids have a very difficult time, especially those coming in from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds, have a very difficult time catching up. They're not the sharpest peas in the pod necessarily academically, but even other than that, in this day and age, if you're working in manufacturing, you need the basic ability to be able to read a manual. They're unable to do that. They're not well equipped to do that. And that is because the cognitive ability skills are very low relative to what they ought to be. There's no clear linkage, but clearly the deprivation early in life, and for these are kids on the economic and social margin, clearly would be playing an important role. Beyond that, as you see, there are repercussions for productivity. The costs of morbidity in terms of days lost because of sickness or poor health are again staggering. And in fact, President Dasgupta has worked on the pioneering study, and this which was published by the World Bank, which remains the most quoted study today as well. It offers the most precise data as well. So again, despite the remarkable improvements in per capita income, in growth since 1991, malnutrition seems to be almost immune to changes in economic circumstances, to the improved economic circumstances. And research has shown in a fairly strong manner that the single main, this is primarily due to malnutrition, and the single main cause of malnutrition is open defecation. It doesn't take a lot to imagine how open defecation would impact the food chain. It has an immediate impact on the water supply, of course, through that the food supply chain, and consequently on public health as well. And I just have a few quick numbers here. Professor Mitra mentioned 600. The numbers I've seen range from 570 to 620. So 600 million is out of a population of 1 billion which lacks access to, which defecates out in the open globally. So it's a huge, overwhelming percentage is in India. 130 million households don't have toilets, and the problem is primarily heavily concentrated in the rural areas. Heavily concentrated, and that's where my focus will be. Professor Dasgupta is going to talk more about the urban landscape. The picture is not static by any means. The total numbers have come down by 31%. You would think it's a remarkable achievement. It sounds remarkable. 31% is a huge drop in the percent of population that's engaged in OD. The multilateral agencies classify that as moderate progress because, as you'll see in a few minutes, the extraordinary progress other countries in India's immediate neighborhood have made show up in very stark relief to these numbers. So a very quick digression on history, and this is, you might recall, for those of you who did ancient history, you would recall maps of Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, Takshila, Harappa, and one of the things that really stood out were the public baths and the private baths as well, and very well developed sanitation systems. And these are sanitation systems which were basically designed to take away wastewater away from urban areas. And the reason why obvious reasons why civilizations developed close to sources of water was it would go back. The wastewater was not recycled in the sense we know it today, but because it was essentially returned to the water sources, and with the dilution, most of the ill effects that we know today are diluted. And this is not just the Indus Valley civilizations. It's been seen in the Incas, the Mayan civilizations, ancient in China, the archaeological records across the world. The problems, of course, arose as urban centers developed and as, during the feudal times, when access to these resources became more unequal. I'm going to jump forward and not spend too much time on the historical, but just to point out that this is, again, if you look at any country's record, you look at Melbourne, as our colleague Robin Jeffrey has pointed out, you'd find, and pardon the colloquialism, poop on the streets, literally. New York City, if it hadn't been for the advent of the automobile, was almost overrun by horse manure from carriages, and disposal of that around the turn of the last century had become a major problem. And that had led to very serious morbidity issues. So the problem has been persistent, and with the growth of populations, it's become more acute. In rural areas, still, it tends to be less, and in India, the problem is acute, remains acute, and that is, for an economist, if you're looking at the data scientifically, it remains a puzzle. And this is a table that shows, I'm not sure if you can see that, the blue circles are per capita income, and the orange lines, the orange bars, denote the percentage of population that defecates out in the open. The most serious, the highest open defecation is in Niger, Madagascar, in declining order, Malawi, and then India. And you can see out here that countries with far lower per capita incomes have much higher levels of open defecation. A table that's even more revealing, and I did a selection of the countries. I'm not sure if you can see the numbers here. I'll just read them out to you. This is from the WHO UN Water Global Analysis WASH report, DLAWAS report from earlier this year, and this tabulates data for urban and rural defecation and sanitation from 1993 points, 2000 and 2015. And we look at Bangladesh, which Professor Mitra mentioned earlier, the numbers have come down from 34% in 1990 to 19.2 in 2000 to 1.2% in 2015. Likewise, in Nepal, which culturally would consider the closest to India in terms of social structures, again, the numbers have come down from a much higher level, 88% aggregate in 1990 to 64, and now it's down to 31, which is still high. Likewise, for Pakistan, it's come down dramatically. Philippines is very low. Sri Lanka has more or less eliminated. India does remain an outlier along with one other country, large country, and that is Nigeria, where the problem has remained static on a low number. It's actually increased marginally. Incidentally, if you're looking at infant diarrhea, Nigeria and India account for 40% of total cases and a very high proportion of mortality due to diarrhea as well. Okay. So what are the consequences? What's really going on in the body, in the child's body? The condition is known as environmental enteric dysfunction, or more broadly, it's called entropy. And what it does essentially in a nutshell is, once you're affected by the microbes, the intestinal tract, entire body is oriented towards fighting those microbes and keeping the body alive and going, rather than nurturing growth. And that in a nutshell explains why with rising incomes, doesn't matter how much your diet's going up, everything that you're consuming is going towards just keeping you alive. And this is something that doesn't discriminate across income lines. 20% of children in the richest one out of every 4 children in the richest 20% are affected, are stunted. Contaminated water does not discriminate across. And even if you're getting bottle supply, you just have to touch. And you know what happens if you're getting cut, the hazards of buying cut fruit or cut vegetables. And what a sharp contrast for me, a culture shock was going into Laos and you're almost eating offal perhaps, and cut fruits and vegetables, and you never gave a second thought, or getting ice from the street and adding it to your drink. Okay. And this condition it has of course devastating and sustained health factors, is a major reason. And just to give you an idea of the scale again, every 3 minutes, and this is data for India, a child dies due to diarrhea. Another thing that you realize when you talk to a doctor is the huge proportion of Indians that have Mebius or waterborne in some form or the other. It's usually dormant. 15% of the population has it in a fairly acute, and a much larger proportion has it in a dormant form. And this is something can rear up. And again, it's basically due to contaminated water supply. The story becomes much worse if you're looking across gender. I mean, there's already a deep-rooted gender bias in the country. There's the nutritional deprivation, the studies which have documented extensively how young girls suffer from nutritional deprivation in India relative to male offspring. But it doesn't take a lot to extend the story further and realize if the mother is poorly fed and malnourished, the child likewise is going to be severely affected and impaired. Okay. Yet it remains a mystery why this is something that remains neglected. And here's the number again, the cost. This is, I was talking to Professor Dasgupta a little earlier, the methodology for this 2015 study done by Lixil, an entity in Tokyo. It's in the pharma sector, and Oxford Economics and WaterAid. It shows that India's loss because of poor sanitation is 5.2%. The next is Laos, which has made remarkable progress, 3.2%, and then you can see the others. So India, that token is almost double. A more reliable number, these are in billions. The rupee numbers might strike you as a bit curious. It was in trillions and then it's been chopped off. This is a study from which you worked, right? 2006 study, which was published in 2011. And this classifies the costs of poor sanitation. At this time, it was 50 billion, amounting to roughly 6% of GDP. So more than 6% of GDP was lost annually on account of poor sanitation. We know what the benefits of advanced infrastructure and so on, so investment is. The incremental is significant, but it's 1 to 2 percentage points per year. And this is a breakdown. So premature mortality, of course, accounts for a substantial 70% of the health-related costs. The others are productivity losses, which are probably an underestimate, doesn't take into account morbidity, which continues till quite late in life, and then the cost of water supply and the amount of time spent accessing the, water. Incidentally, speaking of cognitive abilities, I mean, most of you would have heard of Pratham. This is an entity, an NGO in India, which does absolutely remarkable work in assessing cognitive skills in that, academic levels. And one of the metrics that Pratham is using now is going into schools, and particularly where girls go, and seeing if toilet facilities are present. That is a very powerful indicator of the ability of young girls to attend school, and that holds for less than, I haven't seen the latest data, far less than 50% of schools. And that accentuates the gender disparity, of course. So this is just the same data in words. So why does it persist, and why hasn't something been done about? Why hasn't the government been proactive? I don't have an answer to that. We can turn to that later. But as to why it persists, the major cause, which Professor Mitra also alludes to, is notions of purity, which is essential for worship in the house, pollution, which is deemed to arise from the presence of fecal matter within the domestic, no matter where they go, in a flush or wherever, and untouchability. And untouchability alone explains a substantial percentage of house. So, and that's the reason why, for those of you attending a seminar here about a year and a half ago, when the speaker of one of the state assemblies was here, talking about how many toilets they'd constructed, the question that arose was, okay, so how many of these are functional? And there was no follow-up on that. How many connected to water sources or a sustainable waste matter removal system? That hadn't been. It's just the raw structures that were being put up. And what was striking, I didn't find the precise phrase it was used. I mean, if you took away the word Mahatma Gandhi, it would strike you as particularly, and the phrase he used at that time was the Asiatic people and the word dirty, and how we need to learn from the West. Those are, it would make a lot of hairs bristle today if we read that. But essentially, that's something he experienced during a cholera break during his days in South Africa. And that is where the motivation, just looking at the health and other effects, the motivation for saying things like why sanitation is as important, if not more important, than independence or cleanliness is next to godliness. To be honest, we just took it as odd slogans as a kid. The first time I came across, I guess I'm pretty slow-witted. It's only much later in life you realize his own experiences that underpin that, and the gravity of the effects that arose as well. Okay. And what you find again is, this is very recent, 2017, in 40% of households, somebody still, with toilets, somebody still chose to go and do it outside, go out in the fields. And in certain subcultures in the North, it's considered a macho thing to do. And you also see this patriarchy manifest itself in how it's like, this is a very common phrase, I want to do it for the women folk in the house. I don't need one, really. This is the male member speaking. It's for the security of my wife and my daughter-in-law that I'm making a toilet. I have a place to go to. What that also speaks of is a huge failure. If you put aside issues of caste and all that will become a very handy whipping horse. Clearly, this is a situation where there's a profound need for a case of market failure of a different sort and a profound need for the state to intervene. Okay. However, as is in most cases, and Professor Mitra also alluded to that at the beginning in his earlier comments, if you look at a disaggregated picture, and we're getting more and more data today, not just the state level, but at district level, you find significant differences across states. Kerala alone stands out in the south. Tamil Nadu has a severe problem with open defecation. Andhra Pradesh does, Karnataka does, but Kerala stands out, the northeastern states and some of the northwestern states, and the hill states. And this is something I've experienced myself. The consciousness in Himachal Pradesh, in Uttarakhand, about the need to keep the environment clean and about the need to, let the trees be. You may remember the Chipko movement goes back. There seems to be much greater awareness of the links with nature and how important it is to sustain. Those states is much lower. Within, the biggest problem is the states with a high, ironically, population and density and a high population density, and that is Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh. Gujarat has, and Andhra Pradesh, which are economically far more advanced states, also have, and this is in large measure explained by the presence of untouchability, which is more vigorously manifest in those states. The Northeast, you've already mentioned, there's cultural dissimilarities, and that to large measure explains. But what is more interesting is if you look even further, so this is the state level differences. Okay, we just spoke of. This is the Rice Institute, the Research Institute in Compassionate Economics. It's an institute based in Delhi, founded by 2 economists and a cohort of other researchers. We've compiled this database which shows a disaggregated district level picture. And you get a far more nuanced story here. So even within the states which have the most serious problems, within within Bihar, UP, Jharkhand, you find a certain districts with the higher population density that the problem is a lot more severe. And this provides insights as well. Okay. So the damage, just to give you an idea of the numbers, this is Shekhar, TV Shekhar. He's the Director General of the Public Health Foundation of India, so it's not a voice from out of the wilderness. And he's been speaking very unequivocally and says, compared to any other, this is probably arguably the biggest loss of human capital in history on account of this problem, and far exceeds the numbers that were affected by HIV, AIDS, and a bunch of other major diseases combined. And the other important reason, I don't have time, I can go into the policy issues later, is these 3 points about durable, because once you get past the age of 2 and 5, and there's an awareness of the need for hygiene and sanitation, that's a lifelong asset. If you have your health, it's an inalienable, nobody can take it away from you, it's portable, it's there with you wherever you are. And a very important and a profound case for intervention, direct state intervention, is the extraordinarily high returns. It is some of the highest returns for every dollar you put in that you invest in sanitation. It offers the lowest estimate is 550%. Some estimates go up to $35 for every dollar invested. And these are the externalities. So I should wrap up very soon. It's the generation of negative externalities which in themselves offer a very compelling rationale for intervention by the state. It's also that this is a public good. If one person in the family is still going out, despite the presence of a loo in the house, it doesn't really help. It's going to affect. And this is where I also see glimmers of hope. You mentioned the community-led total sanitation scheme. Even in areas where caste and other issues are where the CLTS has been applied, it's worked very well. And this is the way it works. You get all the people in the village get together. and it's got to be very collegial. So in an open piece of land, usually, with a stick on the dust, you draw a map. Okay, so you tell us where did you go, you tell us where you go, which way you go, where do you stop and do it. And what people start seeing very soon is, okay, so-and-so, I'm affecting that person's water supply notionally, she's affecting mine, I'm affecting hers, and the close interlinkages become very happy. What did not happen in many districts, many places in India, is the follow-up visit. So once you've got the message across, that has to be reinforced and reinforced. These are changes in habits which are deeply entrenched, and the men also have to get past that culture. Unfortunately, that was not being fed. Unlike some in Malawi and a bunch Cameroon and I forget where else, and Bangladesh, as you mentioned, was remarkable. So it's not rocket science, and even the notions of caste and untouchability, despite how deeply rooted they are, they're not immutable, and the behaviors are not immutable there. Okay, I think I'm out. I'll wrap up here, and you can just return to any of the issues during the questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Quick question? Okay, I've got a quick question. I've got two quick questions. One of the statements you made, which came across to me as striking, was that it doesn't matter who defecates, it affects everyone. So, open defecation should be in the category of an infectious disease where it can be criminalized the way smallpox vaccination has been criminalized. That you don't like vaccination, you don't have a choice. So, why has it not been given the status of a public bad so that it will be criminalized? The second issue is a statistical issue. Might there be a fallacy of aggregation in the relationship between the wealth or wealthiness of a state and level of open defecation? Because those who defecate may not be the ones who are wealthy. So by taking a larger unit as a unit of analysis, one is making a causal relationship at a lower level.
Right, yeah.
Okay?
Thank you. Those are very good questions. I'm glad you raised them. Why can't it be viewed as a public bad? You can't take legal action. I mean, that is not, that may not be feasible. That's the first blush. But where there's education,
In Singapore,
yeah.
you can't do it in the public.
Well, Singapore's a metropolis. It's a small, compact city. So I'm very hesitant. I wouldn't compare that to. I'll just finish off in.
Enforcing the negative law, enforcing the law is equally important.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that cannot be possible in a country with a huge population.
Certainly, yeah. So one of the things I'm very hesitant about is I was becoming conscious. I'm almost doing, it's more like rather than a seminar, I'm making it more like an advocacy, half-baked advocacy talk. But having said that, again, when you mention CLTS, it's got to be by mutual and universal consent. And places where it's worked, and in India, there are many examples of small areas of success, pockets of success. And this is where then, when an awareness comes in, there's social sanction as well. People turn around and, I saw your husband do that. Or the kids. And the kids can be a very powerful disciplining, very powerful disciplining instrument at home. So it's got to be, this is something that has to come. And one of the points I was making is not the supply. There has to be a demand for toilets. And that's when you know that there are solutions being found. It has to come from within, and realization that, yes, this is going to affect my child, it's going to affect my parents, my partners, sibling, my neighbors, everybody. And we are in all of us are together. And that's what would work. You're absolutely right about the fallacy of composition. In the wealthy states, so what the data did was it showed states where there's a higher prevalence of untouchability. That's where the open defecation is higher, because the entire issue surrounding scavenging and removal, the physical removal of human waste. So that's one of the oddities in India that people want really, where a $30 or $40 or $100 toilet will work. People want couple of hundred, spend several hundred or 1,000. They want a toilet with a pit so deep that you never have to go in and clean, because I can't touch it. How can I carry out any rituals? So that's a response without any attitudinal change. But I mentioned caste and all that become a whipping horse. Yes, it is an impediment. It's not immutable. Behaviors do and have changed. So the fantasy composition alluded to where this was manifest more, not across all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In his response, Dr. Dipinder made an important point which we should take note of. When I say we, I mean my colleagues. You had a question also?
Just a fact to add on your question, that I got one WhatsApp message of a newspaper clipping. District Magistrate of Rohtas district in Bihar has taken that public bad thing where they not only are enforcing making toilets, giving the government aid, but those who are not using that, they are imposing some fine on them. And the villager committee is trying to make sure that who have benefited from the toilet program, they use that. But is it true across the board? I don't know.
Wonderful for Bihar to show the way. But the point that Dipinder was making is very important for the profile of the institute. He said we shouldn't start talking like an advocacy group. Advocacy groups would say open defecation is bad, it should not take place. Where is the distinction between advocacy and analysis? We are, as a think tank come research institute, are a group committed to analysis in terms of causal explanations. Within those causal explanations, we are expected to show various alternative possibilities. So we are talking about costs and benefits, incentives, institutional constraints, which constrain behavior. And that is very important for a think tank to remember, that we are here for analysis, and within that analysis to show possible policy alternatives to our stakeholders. With this, I would now invite Dr. Shubhagato Dasgupta to present his paper, From Taboo to Totem, Continuing Misadventures of Sanitation Policy in India.
Thank you, Professor Mitra. I'll just add a line of thanks from CPR's end too. CPR is a co-host for this event, I hear. So thank you all for being here. What means my story is a sanitation story for India, but focuses on urban and focuses very much on, means it's a policy story which dwells a bit into the academic underpinnings of the often proposed approach, and looks at some of the current and ongoing research which is surely getting much deeper in India now around the topic than it has ever done been looked at in the past. From the presentation generally, the talk covers urban sanitation in India, the historic and international context, some of which is similar to the rural one, but there are particularities that are different, which I'll just talk you through. There are the Swachh Bharat mission itself, the design of the program, and what actually is being reported on it. And finally, some entrance policy issues that the program will need to address if it was to deliver on what it sets out as its mandate. So I mean, just starting, just to lay the backdrop of what is the target or the goal that everyone imagines good sanitation to be, is a 200-year, 150-year-old conceptualization of what modern sanitation is, and a trigger point for this is acknowledged to be something called the Sanitation Revolution, which emanated out of London, which was with a great stink in the Thames, where the Parliament itself was shut down for more than a week because at that stage the medical understanding around sanitation was that stink causes disease. It was later, 30 years later, that the connection between sanitation, water supply, and diarrhea was established, but another 30 more years before it got recognized in the scientific community. Another 30 years before the vaccine and the tablets to antibiotics around this was developed, and that has transformed, in one sense, the development of the sector itself. So all the early progress on improved sanitation in the West has happened in this period, which is 70, 80 years from, let's say, the 1850s onwards. And then there was, with the antibiotics, there was a little bit of, under attention paid to infrastructure in general to create sanitized communities. But in the 1980s, it was established as a dictum across multilateral institutions, and it then had very specific geographies in the South, which in one sense is also connected to the global disease syndrome. So there was some diseases which were affecting the Western world, which were also considered to be coming out of these specific geographies. And part of that whole dominant debate was the establishment that if we were to have sanitized cities or sanitized communities across the world, we would all benefit from it. So that's the general background to a very, very easy oversimplified explanation of what seemed to have happened then. But as Dipinder pointed out, across all countries, if you run regressions, you see that as a principle, as sanitation improves, infant mortality rates go down. And yes, India is an outlier to it, and has remained in spite of many years of work. So the first sanitation policies in India date back to the 1980s. It was also then the International Water and Sanitation Decade for the United Nations, and there were internationally a lot of campaigns run, and even what was then the Central Rural Sanitation Program in 1986, I guess, was launched with Sanitation for All as its mandate, right? And since then, 2-3 generations of sanitation programs have been implemented in India. It is only from, let's say, 2005 or so that urban sanitation became a part of the sanitation thinking, because all of the earlier schemes looked at rural sanitation, and it did look at what we generally refer to in India as manual scavenging, to eradicate manual scavengers. There was a little bit of that, but as a sector in its own right, urban sanitation became more important to policymakers with the National Urban Sanitation Policy in 2008, and then finally, for the first time, in one big sweep, the Swachh Bharat mission has both an urban component and a rural component. Where the earlier programs, national programs, were essentially rural focused. These numbers you've seen, just to point out that while the Millennium Development Goals were being mapped and tracked, it was sanitation was one of the only benchmarks that were not reached. Even water supply benchmarks were reached globally. It was only sanitation as one. It was the most important one that got missed, and India was the largest contributor to it. So if India had succeeded, the global goal would have succeeded. So within this context, coming into an election from what is considered to be more right-wing the Prime Minister, as a candidate to be the Prime Minister, made an announcement that toilets are more important than temples. And that caught a lot of attention and imagination in the press, and during the election period was something that ran a lot of debates. And then in continuation to that, when he did win the election, he set out what is called the Clean India Mission now, or the Swachh Bharat Mission. The Swachh Bharat Mission urban is what I'm going to speak about, so it doesn't really fully apply to rural differences, but I'm not going to get into that very much. I'm going to speak mainly about the urban side of it. So there are a set of objectives set out under the mission, which is to eliminate open defecation, manual scavenging, modern scientific solid waste management, generate awareness, capacity augmentation of local bodies, and create an enabling environment for private sector contribution to sanitation. And then it kind of sets out a list of things that it will fund through this program. And they are essentially, of course, household toilets, community toilets, solid waste management infrastructure, public toilets, and behavior change communication, or IEC as it is called in the government literature. Each of these, of course, has a particular model for financing, which some of which invite private sector to be part of its construction. There are associated models that they put out of states and cities where they've done well, and they explain these models for other states and cities to emulate. And then the funding flows. Essentially, it's the funding goes down to the state level, and the state level identifies the requirements in the local bodies, and then funds the local bodies to do to build this infrastructure. Interestingly, there has been lots more interest around behavior change or IEC communication this time. However, in the government program itself, it is a smaller component than it used to be in the earlier avatar of the scheme. But what has happened is that both the media and the corporate sector has played quite a significant role in adding to this pot of funds for behavior change communication. Also, interestingly, a lot more national level and international resources have kind of flowed into the sector. For example, the Swachh Bharat cess, which was in place, had service came out of all the service tax gathered by the government. There is corporate social responsibility, mandatory corporate social responsibility funds being applied. The World Bank has done possibly one of its biggest loans to India on the subject. The USA, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the German technical assistance, for example, are other examples of a lot of international interest on the subject in India. How has this moved? I mean, it was launched on the 2nd of October 2014, and this is what the website tells us today on urban sanitation. It tells us that these 6 states have declared themselves open defecation free in urban areas. It tells us that 1,325 of the 5,000 Indian cities have declared themselves open defecation free. And that solid waste management is improving, etc. A lot of interesting stories around this. But there are also enough reports about underutilized infrastructure or substandard infrastructure coming from the press. The unevenness of the distribution. So these states, for example, which are reporting huge success, are kind of concentrated and have a long trajectory. For example, at the start of the mission in 2013-14, if you were to do an analysis of the states, you could actually have 3 bundles of states. One which was around the national average, and you know, were as Mr. Siravakrishnan would say, neither here or not there. And then a whole bunch of states which were anyway better performers, and a few lagging ones, right? So very much of that gets maintained in programs like this. However, from the urban sanitation perspective, the open defecation exercise, or which has come to mean more directly in the urban space more than in the rural space, being equivalent to the access to a toilet, which is negotiated through either an individual toilet or access to a loosely defined access to a community toilet. Yeah? So it could be a kilometer away and you could still have access. Those kinds of constraints, but within that, open defecation in India's urban areas is surely achievable. Means at business as usual by 2025, if new cities were not added to our cities list, it would have gone out of there as per projections that we've made. But the target has been preponed by 6 years as per the mandate of the Swachh Bharat mission. Just a slide on the definition of open defecation free having moved over the last 10 years. It's not a new term. I mean, it is a very new term. It was actually coined in 2001 with the CLTS exercise succeeding in Bangladesh, and now it is as part of the global goals for the Sustainable Development Goals. But it isn't the same open defecation free that we saw in that community. It's not defined the same way anymore. So the definitions have been evolving, and in India, in urban, it just means you don't see any feces when you move around. Yeah? So you can still hide it. I guess that must also be happening to an extent, but the government, in one sense, at the senior level, surely the Prime Minister has alluded to the fact that he is very well aware of many of these challenges that earlier missions, earlier programs have faced. So if we were one of the big benchmarks of it was that in the earlier mission, which was called the Total Sanitation Campaign, the government's own surveys had told us that by 2011, 78% of our households in rural areas were covered and serviced with individual toilets. Later that year, when the census came out with its own measure around access to individual toilets, it was reduced. That figure got corrected to 35%. So from 78 to 35, it moved in the matter of the survey you were doing, right? And so that everyone is very mindful of, and I'm hoping that the census does a good job next time and isn't made into another government survey. But what is also being tracked, for example, is citizens' feedback through ministry level surveys, but citizens' feedback. So even in our best city, the open defecation free city, which seems to have achieved many of its goals, the leading city in India, user response is being tracked. So it means even to the government, or less than half the people have agreed to the fact that the city is always clean, or are there dustbins available, or are there toilets within the standard range that one would need to have them. So these are being watched in one sense, and there is some introspection happening. For example, post the Swachh Bharat mission, there has been a new policy which looks at this, the more complete flow of the waste within the city. So not only toilets, but also how it gets removed and disposed. There's been some additional thinking around that. And that, of course, is well aligned to what the global community is also thinking, and in the new Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. They have, over the next 15 years, it's not only toilets that were being measured, are going to be measured as it was under the Millennium Development Goals. We are also going to measure the whole waste stream and the whole waste flow. So the government is introspecting on it and changing the policy as we go ahead. Now, within this context, here are some ideas that are being debated as we speak on this policy matter, and one of the key debates currently in the press and across parties and across cities actually, given this that we are just coming out of the rainy season, has been the number of deaths due to what is called manual scavenging, what city sanitation workers have had to deal with. Here are just some pictures, but the big claim that is coming from the press and the intellectuals is that the Clean India mission is prioritizing open defecation in India while compromising the social safety and health aspects of sanitation workers. It's a clearly articulated claim at the moment, and so this is one of the social policy particularities of the Indian sanitation context that we need to understand better, and that policy will need to address. And the Prime Minister has started speaking about this issue, and there is expected to be some new debates in Parliament about it. But I'm very hopeful and quite convinced that the policy will try and come up with a policy response to some of this. But what does it tell us? For example, what does the data tell us? It tells us that 2% of the national workforce is in the cleaning business. It tells us that 1,500 people over the last 2 years have died out of these poor practices. There are different kinds of work within in sanitation. Some which are manual scavenging, others that are municipal sweepers, rag pickers, the septic tank emptiers, cleaners of open drains, sewerage systems. The more hazardous the activity is, the better the commercial return is. Of course, the indignity and impurity associations with this task, which Dipinder has also talked about briefly. And this legal framework and social action around it has been very, it's been difficult to understand because, while it has changed the historic behavior and association of the waste worker with both the service, the client, as well as with the municipality. So for over a 50, 75 year period, from the colonial times to late, to the 70s, municipal workers scavengers were employed as municipal workers. Since the 1990s, actually, the practice became more illegal, and much of this has become contractual activity and unaccountable, more hidden than in the past. Often now what we are seeing in primary research is that this is no more the primary occupation. This is the secondary occupation. So when you do surveys, they don't mention it. But they're involved in this activity at night and as secondary occupation. But in all cases, it is from this population, which is 15% of the national population. The press is still reporting stories, for example, not so long back from Coimbatore, where even an MBA from that community, when his father died, was offered this job only. As compensatory, there are many compensatory provisions which allow for the job, but they are not. But it's only for that job, not for being employed in the institution. the distinction in the law and the standards is also very unclear. There is what is not well understood is whether the manual scavenger, the differences between manual scavenging, manual scavenger, hazardous cleaning, there's a whole bunch of technical issues around it. There is evidence to show that the design of some of these systems have not been have not taken operation and cleaning into consideration itself. So the way the sewer systems are designed itself has been designed keeping in mind that cheap labor who do only this work is going to be available for eternity. So the health and safety considerations have been compromised. There are the investments that you require if you were to not have someone physically go down into the sewer to clean it would require that on an emergency basis certain sections of the pipe, for example, are changed. For that, the resources need to be at the local level with the engineer to allow for that work to happen. A lot of that is not yet in place. But in terms of social dimensions of sanitation, the specificity of it needs to be better understood. There are the issues around marginal communities that is coming to the fore also quite a bit, where, as you mentioned in Bihar, there is coercive measures being used to get people on board of this toilet construction. But, for example, I visited Dhenkanal that day, so the people in the tribal areas haven't even acclimatized to wearing footwear, so it means it'll be nice to have a fancy toilet, but they, live in more or less in the shed with a great toilet and with no footwear. And, for them to be forced into using a toilet it means there are lots of issues around managing to do that. And of course, women and children, there's a lot of initial information coming out on how disproportionately getting a toilet into a facility, into a community which doesn't have good access to water means more drudgery for the women itself, because they have to get more water from further away than in the past. So there are these considerations of the particularities of our circumstance that need to come make its way into the policy itself. Yeah, means in urban areas, of course, the issue of slums, where tenure, security is itself the problem, and there is such a diversity of access within a particular slum that you might have a community toilet, but there are many households that don't use it. There are renters who don't want to build, who can't build new toilets, etc., etc. So there's there are levels of issues involved, and as Dipinder mentioned, the community toilet use itself. So while a community toilet creates what is called an open defecation community or a slum in India, because of the long queues and the duration of use in the morning, the 2 hours before you go to work, the queues are so long that people prefer, can't wait for it, and only the women seem to be using this. This is one example of it. So how we rethink these, the unequal circumstance under which these policies apply needs to be part of I think the next revision of the Swachh Bharat mission. And another big issue that's emerging at the national level is the need to converge and integrate the multiple objectives of the government. So in the urban ministry itself, there is the smart cities, the Amrut cities, the housing for all with similar targets, 2019, 2022, 2020, and means if you build new housing, you do build a toilet. But so you build the toilet and you build the housing and you meet multiple. So there needs to be an integration of the objectives being set out, and these actually result in conflicts on the ground. So there are slums that I've visited where the smart city scheme has dislocated, or they have to be rehabilitated because the smart city scheme is doing an investment there. So so the integration of these objectives at the national level need to come out. And there is it is possible, for example, to do these multi variable analysis. For example, you know, in this crunching of data, it becomes evident that you are more likely to have a toilet in your house if you are connected to an open or closed drain. You're lesser likely with a open drain, and quite unlikely to maintain a toilet if you don't have a drain. If you are a scheduled tribe and you move to and the OBC category person has 1.65 times the probability of using the toilet than the scheduled caste. Means just by the macro data we have when we look at on it. But you could do that at the state level, and you could do that across quantiles too. And some of this data will, I hope, allow for a little more flexible design at the levels where the operation needs to happen. Of course, means we need greater authority and accountability with the local body in terms of both leadership but also governance. And larger cities have are very different from smaller cities. As an example, the kind of infrastructure that they use and work with, the governance structures in smaller cities are very different, and there are rural governance structures present even in larger geographies in India. So a lot of this needs to be looked at, and in terms what Swachh Bharat has missed out on and will need to address in the future is an institutional reform story, where while it stays delinked financially to where the toilet needs to be placed, it will need to look at the overlapping roles between the city and the state. It will need to look at fragmentation of responsibility. It will have to improve the links with the citizenry and the local government, and it will have to build capacity. So means what we I think are looking forward to in a new revised Swachh Bharat is a bunch of institutional reform issues too. And one last other policy twist would come from the emerging need for co-production of sanitation. And the Prime Minister himself in his speeches alludes to it all the time, that it is participatory, it's not for governments to do alone, etc., etc. But in terms of putting that within the scheme and getting partnerships between the private sector, or let's say the NGOs and the government, to happen on the ground, there's quite a bit of way to go. The schemes are very inflexible and do not allow for that. But hopefully soon, or sooner than later, some of these issues will be addressed. And finally, means at the political level, the articulation of the scheme allows for all of these changes, or all of these multiple theoretical pursuits to be incorporated in the scheme. It's only, I guess, a matter of detailed design and working with the implementers to get us there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive, policy-driven presentation. Is there any specific question? Dr. Ronoja Sen.
Just a couple of very quick questions. One of the things you mentioned, Shubhagato, was it's difficult to capture the data, right? But you did have a lot of data from NSSO surveys plus your own experience. But going by your fieldwork experience, what is your experience of seeing? Of course, there are targets that have been met by the government, if you see the statistics. But are the toilets, the toilets being used for the purposes they've been built? What are the numbers? Because for the earlier programs, we have seen examples of the toilets being just used as another extra room. And the second question is the sort of the political question that you alluded to. Is there a quantum jump in the funds that are being allocated to Swachh Bharat? Because of course, there are predecessors to the program, as is sometimes forgotten now. Or is there actually a much more successful repackaging, marketing of the program, which has actually allowed linkages with corporates. NDTV, for instance, has this thing with debt also. There is, it's been marketed much more successfully than the earlier governments ever did.
Thanks. Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. And I mean, as I mean, these are, I guess, the heart of the issues. I mean, on the data, I guess what I was trying to say is that while there is some level of data, means having it at the right scale, like Professor Mitra was saying initially, and the data to be analyzed at the level of the decision maker, and what level which decision needs to be taken, it still remains to be a constraint, because some of the more qualitative information is not captured in much of this. So while it is abstractable to the state level with some sort of precision, below that I'm not very sure we have enough to generate that, and much of that should be qualitative anyway. So that, there are issues around the data of that nature. The targets being met, means there is a, means I think this is a varied picture across states. There is the implementation is surely more targeted than before, and there is lots more excitement around it and much better marketing, and it is no more taboo, as my presentation says, to talk about sanitation in any policy circle. It means it could be international trade and you could talk about sanitation happily. No, so it has broken that barrier, and it gives lots more access to every department in government. But means I'm not very sure it yet deals with the more structural issues that are required in transforming the sector, as was the focus of my presentation. And there is significant, I think, overall application of money into the sector. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Chanderia?
Mr. Dasgupta, my family is involved in sanitation in Gujarat, Madras, state of Madras at that time, and also Cochin and that area, because we were working in that area and this thing. We have just not been able to do any of those things because it was, we believe in one thing that is not very important. Second thing, the ladies are not, have been educated. Third thing, we have one thing, believe that we cannot touch an untouchable man, which is defined by the people of living around. Unless it is wiped out from that area, we will not be able to do whatever we have, you said this time, another 20, 50 years, it is not going to come. Because I'm talking of 1940, and today is 2017. Still, it is like that. It has not been improved. Only education will be able to do that, and teaching women how to tolerate inequality and also to take part in that. Cleanliness is first thing what we need, and we can do it, and they take the thing in their hand, it will be nice. Only 3 days ago, I read an article that there was a marriage ceremony and everything, and the Dullah also came there, and the girl said, if you have a toilet in your place, he said no, said goodbye, she went away from the. Now that courage, if we don't have, or don't have any people or even children, I don't think so. We will, what we want to do, another 50, 80, 900 years, it's not going to come. I am talking of 1940. Okay? And this, your theory, you did everything, but have you seen any fellow who has gone with the jadu gone to any sanitary place? No. Cleaning out the road, cleaning of this. Well, that is everything. Anyone can do it. But going to a toilet and show them how to do it, wait for 3 hours there or 2 hours and see how the people are doing this thing. And another thing, just to, Toronto is the city where the general toilet sanitation headquarters is here in Toronto. And he has been also very difficult for him to convince this thing. When Mr. Modi was here, I introduced him to him, and then they started talking. But still, because the officer under them, if they are not cooperating, I think it is not going to be that very easy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to respond? Or shall we hold on to it for the general conversation? Okay. Then I would now turn to our third and last speaker. Maitreyee Mukherjee is beginning to work on a PhD on the Ganges River Basin. It's not so much river basin that interests us, but river pollution, and that's what her paper is about. Maitreyee.
Thank you.
Do you want to speak to the microphone?
Sure. I think my voice would be loud enough. Just I'm waiting for my slides to come on the screen. Yeah, that's one. That one. Yeah, I can. Actually, I'm planning to just look at my laptop. Thank you. I would start thanking the organizers for this opportunity. I'm really honored. Now coming to today's presentation, I will be shifting the discussion away from sanitation to more of a root cause for why we need sanitation, as well as a consequence of lack of sanitation, that is river pollution, and how do we combat river pollution in India, the policy measures and governance challenges. So since the topic is too broad, I would be just highlighting briefly over some selected key points, and then as the discussion goes later, we can focus on certain issues. And another point to remember here, I would like to highlight, is that although I would be addressing from the national perspective, but many of the findings and observations here are based on my research focused on the Ganges River Basin management and development. So first, the status of the problem. As we can see from the table itself is quite self-explanatory. CPCB water status reports 29 and 2015. The pollution status in India has almost doubled. And has almost doubled. Switch generation has gone up by 1.5 times. However, the infrastructure development for treatment capacity, wastewater treatment capacity, could not keep pace as much. So this has immense implications over economic growth, environmental health, as well as public health. From a report, it says that nearly 70% of wastewater generated due to lack of treatment capacity has to be dumped untreated into water resources. Just taking a look over the major concerns, the first two, industrial waste and municipal waste. So now these two are more of point source of pollution. This is what we can see with our own eyes, like huge pipes of sewage just being dumped into the rivers. But the third one, which is a diffuse source of pollution, the agricultural practices and runoff, it's another huge source of pollution, but there is no proper standard or measurement about the status of this kind of pollution. Coming next is extraction and diversion of water. India being majorly an agricultural economy, there is much more focus given on irrigation and hydropower electric plants, dams, etc. So even though sometimes compromising the issues of natural river flow and such topics, extraction and diversion of water is being sanctioned recklessly. Just a minute. And then coming to social and religious practices like dumping of dead bodies, immersion of idols, throwing of different ritual offerings, but that just forms a part of the problem. that's not a big, that's not a huge part I want to mention here. Then coming to sediment load, this also, although it's not totally, it's partially anthropogenic and partially natural. After every monsoon season, the sediment load, it causes havoc on the river flow as well as the navigation within major river systems. Lastly, unreliable weather conditions. Now, this directly does not affect pollution, but every year in India we have at first we have a cycle of severe drought season and then a severe flood season. And due to lack of water resource management, and these are these are issues that needs immediate government measures, government attention. So every year when this happens, government's focus moves from pollution, treatment capacity, etc., to the damage control for drought or floods. Hence, the problem of pollution gets forgotten many times. Just a brief overview of the overall institutional structure for water pollution governance. I wouldn't be going in detail, but as you can see from the framework itself, it's not the central government system and the state government system. It's not a nested structure. It's two parallel systems that has its own power, has its own jurisdictions, and works parallelly. They are supposed to communicate within themselves a lot so that it works as a whole holistic system. However, unfortunately, many times it doesn't work, as I'll be explaining later. Now, coming to the governance challenges. First of all, constitutionally, water is a state subject in India. It means that states have the exclusive power to regulate water-related policies, and hence they are not directly accountable to the central authorities. So this makes the central authorities just gives them a advisory, supervisory role. They cannot use command and control authority over the respective state government authorities. Next comes inadequate legal checks. In India, we have well laid out laws in the form of Water Act, Water Cess Act, then Environmental Protection Act, but all these cover water pollution from mostly point sources, specifically industrial pollution. Under these laws, we cannot sue an agricultural enterprise or a municipal body for polluting river systems. And the standards for monitoring these the agricultural and domestic waste it does not come under any kind of a legal framework. And lastly, talking about runoffs, as I said before, there is no standards, no measurement about the nature of the problem. It must be huge. Then coming to multiple agency involvement, like from the previous slide itself, it is quite clear that since the problem itself the scale is large and it has different aspects, so different aspects goes under different agencies, and each agency is answerable to different head offices. For example, here we can see that like initially everything was totally under Ministry of Environment. Now only the Ganges River Basin and some agencies have come under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Water Resources, and the rest part stays under the Ministry of Environment. Along with this, Ministry of Agriculture, Navigation and Transport, and many others, they are working together in collaboration with these two key ministries. So, for example, the key monitoring agency, Central Pollution Control Board, they are directly answerable to Ministry of Environment. However, they also have to, via another National Mission for Clean Ganga, another agency, they are supposedly accountable to the Ministry of Water Resources as well. So, as you can see, it's like overlap of responsibilities and ambiguous specification that leads to a lot of confusion and also lack of accountability. Nobody is everybody is interested to show their KPI, but exactly how much of a project is being delivered, nobody is interested to kind of show that off as a agency itself. Then coming to constant reshuffling of agencies. Sorry. Here, due to frequent change of power system, what happens every time a new government comes, or there is a lot of reshuffling of agencies, lot of reshuffling of administrative officials. So mostly these bureaucrats, they are although they are quite trained and experts in their own fields, but they come for maybe a 5-year period. So their target is whatever they can achieve within that 5 year. So there is many times it has been seen there is lack of long-term goals, long-term projects, and so again that affects the unsustainability and accountability issues. Then coming to, as I've already discussed, lack of inter-agency cooperation, leading to again accountability problems. There is no separate river basin authority in India except one for Ganges. So maximum focus has been given to the Ganges river basin. Most of the other rivers are equally in similar deplorable condition. However, there is no, all the other rivers are clubbed together under the, sorry, it's not working. I want to shift the slide. It's not. Okay, thank you. So, okay. Yeah. So, while the Ganges River is under the Water Resource Ministry, all the other rivers are clubbed under National River Conservation Directorate, which is under Ministry of Environment. So, these kinds of ambiguous lay down of responsibilities leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of lagging in the functioning of the projects. Then inadequate government expenditure. So approximately it has been seen that India spends approximately 0.02% of its GDP behind these conservation and infrastructure development projects. So which is way too less. Rather than comparing to the scale of the problem, 0.02% of GDP is almost nothing. And lastly, absence of people's participation. As it is, the pollution, when the river water resources are polluted, people stop going to those. In India, specifically rivers have they are considered as a living identity. They have a lot of religious and cultural significance. So people go to river for different reasons. But if the rivers are too much polluted, people stop going there. Additionally, bureaucracy level red tapeism. So even if citizens know that there is a problem going on, whom do they go and complain to? And even if they complain, those complaints are not always taken for redressal. So all these issues are making more and more the peoples, the end users of the rivers, more alienated from their own water resources itself. Next, coming to the technical gaps of the problem. Firstly, if you have to address river pollution problem, you have to monitor the issues, monitor the problem, how much of pollution, who are polluting, when they are polluting. So India still lacks enough monitoring facility. Although CPCB, the Central Pollution Control Board, they have more than 1,270 monitoring locations spread all over the country. But these are locations that take only weekly or monthly readings. You need real-time monitoring systems. And that kind of real-time monitoring system has been started only, I think, 1 or 2 years back over the Ganges River Basin, and that too only 113 such real-time monitoring machines exist over only key industrial polluted areas. So these kinds of facilities, although they are quite they help a lot, but it's still way too less compared to the scale of the control measures that we need. Then going to the STPs, presently there is a lot of focus on constructing more and more wastewater systems, wastewater treatment plants. But the system is such that the center plans about it and gives the funds. The state agencies, the regional local agencies, they have to develop it, and the O&M, the operational and maintenance costs as well as the responsibility comes under the state. In many cases, it has been seen that the state lacks these expertise as well as fund. So even if the STP is the sewage treatment plant is built, it is not like once it is transferred to the state agencies, they lack the expertise to operate it or even to maintain it. Then after building of these STPs, it has been found that the connecting localities, the sewage that is generated, the localities are not connected to the STPs. Rather, the sewage flows through other direction into the river, and the STPs lie there with a running under capacity. So these kinds of lack of planning, and because when they set the STPs itself, they have to think about the orientation of the land, whether the sewage, if it is a very old community, suddenly you cannot change the sewage system and connect it to a new STP. So these kinds of planning has been lacking from the very beginning. Then comes the spending of funds. According to an Economic Times report this year, even though huge funds has been donated by international agencies as well as the government budgets, only 7% of the stipulated fund has been spent till now, over from 2015 to 2017. So like there is, I think, another 2 years left by which they have to spend everything. But even if you kind of build such kind of technology and infrastructure very fast, what about the durability and the quality of those infrastructures? You might spend the money, but after spending the money, the kind of output, the kind of service you get, it remains questionable. And last and most important is unavailability of reliable data. So most government reports regarding river pollution, regarding Ganges River statistics, they are very aggregate. You do not find, like, at least I have not seen on a daily basis, weekly basis, any kind of data that helps you to understand what is the problem, when is it increasing, when it is decreasing. The aggregate data never shows you the problem. It's always the same. There is, like, if you graph it out over last 20, 30 years, it has been same. There is like no major no major ups and downs. So basically you see, or what even the government sometimes says, the problem is not as much as being projected by media or academics. Next comes, I would like to discuss something about the gaps in the policy instruments that are not in place yet. First of all, India lacks the centralized command and control power. That is due to the issue of water being a state subject. So from the center, they cannot force, or they cannot force the states to do something and make them accountable for what they have or have not done. Although the center budget, the finance goes from the center, but states are not fully accountable to center for how they are spending those money for water resources within their jurisdiction. Next is a lot of focus has been given to only wastewater treatment. However, the other problem still remains, like development of expertise regionally. How to make these STPs or these regional infrastructure financially sustainable without state help coming every time, because like mostly there is no cess or no tax being collected. Even if these STPs are running full time, they are giving service to the communities. Communities are not paying for it. So how do the rest of course these involves a lot of money. How do the state government without outside help would run these STPs for long? And then there has not been much discussion about involvement of PPP structures, public-private partnership, in development of these STPs. Although in certain places these kinds of models are coming up, but still the government has to be a lot more open to such kinds of such PPP solutions. And again, lastly, addressing adequate communication and accountability gaps between central and state agencies. So these kinds of policy measures or policy problems have not been discussed adequately yet, which leads to still the problem, although there is a lot of discussion specifically on the Ganges River Basin issue. There is a lot of discussion, people are very excited about it, but on grounds, not like there's only talks and talks. On grounds, the actions and the results are not very impressive. Lastly, in India there is absence of market-based instruments like permit system for pollutions, then pollution right trading systems, then levy systems for polluting agencies. So these kinds of strict India has started penalties for polluting agencies, but whenever you pollute, you have to give some tax. That makes an incentive for polluting agencies to build some machineries or arrangements so that the pollution comes down. So these kinds of tax or levy systems has not still been thought about or implemented in India. Already in China, these kinds of market-based instruments have been found to be quite helpful, and they have brought up good results. Now, on a different note, not everything is so gloomy. There is something good also happening on the grounds. So, for example, very recently, the rivers Ganges and Yamuna has been declared as living entities. So the importance of this is that by law they have the right to health and their own privacy. So this has been this living entity status has been given by the Supreme Court. So this means that the governing agencies of the Ganges and Yamuna River, they have the power to act as parent body for the river basins and sue anybody, any agencies, hotels, industries, cities, to sue those for polluting the river. So this has been quite, although still on papers, it has been a quite interesting, it has been a quite substantial step towards operationalizing the way how to reduce, or rather how to bring the polluting agencies under law. Then formation of National Green Tribunal in year 2010 to it is a fast-track judicial system, and it helps in fact it has been addressing many problems very promptly and giving swift decisions, which leads to bringing the polluting agencies under the law and its mechanisms. Then a lot of focus on wastewater treatment has been given. Penalty on polluting agencies, only the industrial sources have been started. It has been declared officially that no more dams would be sanctioned, but only over the main course of the river Ganges. Then there has been a ground force system that has been commissioned. It is called Ganga Task Force. So it is it's a voluntary body with volunteers from local communities and officials or lower level officials from the army. So what they do, they are continuously keeping vigilant over around the banks of the river Ganges, and whoever, for example, idol immersion, dead body throwing, or any other kinds of ritual offering throwing, so whoever comes, or rather being caught doing these things, they try to discuss out with those local people, and if necessary they also take actions accordingly. Then lastly, a lot of riverfront development projects have been initiated, and they have got and finished as well, especially in Varanasi, Ahmedabad, and many other cities. So people are coming back to the rivers and interacting with them. So this is a good sign. This is regenerating interest regarding the importance of rejuvenating the river systems of India. So bringing people back to their own resources, to what belongs to them. And lastly, there has been a lot of fund that has been delegated to villages to make them open defecation free. And so these are villages specifically around the banks of the rivers. Here I'm talking about the Ganges River. I'm not aware of the other rivers. So approximately 1,600 villages have been like given, at least officially, have been given funds and like projected to be open defecation free, so that the municipal wastes or the domestic waste from these villages does not directly go and pollute the rivers. So these are the actions that has been going on ground, but these are still very like compared to the large, humongous scale of the problem, these are still baby steps towards it. But I'll end my presentation by keeping hope that maybe, if not in next 5 years, maybe in next 10-20 years, we will see some real visible positive changes in the way our river systems are and people look at it. Thank you.
Well, Maitreyee, you call them baby steps. I think they're gigantic steps, considering how little used to be done. Is there any specific question for Maitreyee before I open the general discussion? Okay. I mean, as the test is to go from advocacy to analysis, I don't think I could have found any better. So thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for the very inspiring and informative information you have given to us. I have a couple of questions. Number one is the degree or the level of cleanliness of the rivers. Most of the rivers in India are coming from the Himalayas and down, they flow into the Indian Ocean, right? And is there a study made to measure the cleanliness of the river at the source, somewhere near the Himalayas, and then down as it enters into the Indian Ocean, how polluted it has become? That could be a very interesting study. And then we also know that India is predominantly a Hindu country, where the dead are cremated and the the dust of the cremated bodies are thrown into the rivers. And in the other countries like China and other countries, they don't do that. They will just bury the cremated dust into the earth. So how many percent or how much of pollution is being generated by casting the carcasses or the dust of the cremated bodies into the river? How much of that? And could there be a law implemented to stop these practices of throwing the dust of the cremated bodies into the rivers? Indirectly, it is a kind of pollution, but they don't realize it. It becomes a religious rite or practice in India. This could be a very good way to clean up the rivers. And as you mentioned earlier on in your speech, much of the degree of pollution of the rivers have not been measured periodically. It has been done here and there, but it could be monitored more accurately, because India is a blessed country with much of the snow coming from the north, from the Himalayas, the clean, pure water. But man has been responsible to pollute it by his own doing. Domestic pollution is one aspect, but other ways that we can control should be implemented. It's a vast challenge, but it can be done. If you take steps, it can be done, and India can become a country with tremendous potential, with clean water coming all the way from Himalayas.
Thanks very much. Would you like to introduce yourself? I didn't get your name.
My name? I'm a pastor. Okay. I'm a reverend pastor. I'm not a scholar, but I'm a research fellow. I'm very interested in India. And I'm a retired pastor, living in Singapore. And I'm very my knowledge has been tremendously expanded by coming to this type of seminars. And I have a special eye for India, because I was born there, and I was a little boy, came to Malaysia, and now I'm in Singapore. And India has been always in my heart.
Thanks very much. Is it also a question for Maitreyee or a general question?
Actually, I must say it has been excellent presentations by all. I have a suggestion. Very excellent points have been brought out. And the major, everybody has said there are many issues which need to be done, non-monitoring, and many other things which come out. My suggestion is this, I've been in India, that this think tank should, 1, 2, 3, focus these points and say these are the issues. If these are tackled effectively, then only it will make a difference. Everyone says, he said since 1940, 45, nothing is happening. She also brought out many points, about these things could have been better, but for this. For example, the tenure of the people who have to monitor non-spending of funds, only 7%. And similarly, Mr. Dasgupta also brought out many other issues. My suggestion is this, because if you are in the government, you will not be able to criticize, even if you feel it. That is why, because I have been in the government all my life. And the purpose of our discussion, because I'm now in a think tank in India, the purpose of discussion, when we spend so much time, I have been visiting Singapore for the last about 2.5 months and had a chance to come here 5, 6 times because I found it very educative, and I'm going back this week. My suggestion is this, that this think tank should, like this discussion and like other 5, 6 discussions which I attended, make out those point by point points that we feel this can happen and change the performance. And if not done, then there will be no use of having all these schemes. Just a thought. Thank you.
And it's an excellent idea. I could immediately think of a pollution checklist and identify the non-obvious ones. Like from Maitreyee's paper, I am a political scientist, it would have never occurred to me to think of the federal division of powers or distribution of powers as an important reason, that it's allocated where action is needed between for a cooperation between the center and the state. The subject belongs to the state. So the solution there is to take it out of the state list and put it in the concurrent list. That's the kind of non-obvious points that are emerging. Or Mr. Chandaria's point about education. Many of the things that the experts are talking about are not visible to the person out there. How do you make it visible, the causal linkage, that it doesn't matter who pollutes, everyone suffers from hookworms, for example, so that it's a causality that has to be drilled into the heads of people. Where does that happen? It happens at the level of education, sort of basic education. So I take your idea of a checklist very, very seriously. But
the checklist, the strong suggestion must go, in no uncertain terms, capital, that if we have to implement it properly within a time frame, if the funds are to be spent in an optimal manner, if the governance is to be improved, say in no uncertain terms, this is our feeling, a joint discussion, and a system needs upgrading, then these are 1, 2, 3 points which came out during discussion. Yes. This to my mind will help.
Yes. I haven't made a note of it because I will keep the last few minutes to myself to sum up. But before that, I think we should have a round of conversation around the excellent presentations that have been made. And I'll certainly invite our potential doctoral candidate on public service delivery, Tarsha, also to join in if you feel ready, when you feel ready. But the subject is now open for a general conversation. Maitreyee, do you want to already respond to the point that have been made?
Yeah, I would like to respond to the point first. So you made 3 points. First was documenting from source to the end of the river where it discharges into the ocean. These kinds of documentations have been done and they already exist, but as I said, like it's not a very rigorous periodic measurement. There has been already like from academics, like kind of private agencies as well as public agencies who have done these kinds of measurements. It exists and it is seen. So at different, so for example for the Ganges River, it goes a long course. So at different regions, the problem is different. Somewhere it's at the end, it is sedimentation problem. In the middle, it is more of a low river flow and like much of industrial pollution. So this knowledge exists, and it's just like because it is too much complicated to address at one go. So and like as it's always said, the law exists, but implementation is more important. So at those points, government is still lacking how to address these issues. Next, coming to the throwing of dead bodies and how much pollution do they create. So these, as I mentioned during my speech as well, this is just a very small part of the whole problem, because one thing is, as it has been like the cultural belief, the logic behind throwing these ritual offerings, even like the half-burned bodies or even the ashes, these are organic wastes. So even if like the main problem is the visible problem, the aesthetic sense, like when, for example, Varanasi and many other around Allahabad and all these are very important religious and tourist spots for India. And when people go there and see like these kinds of things like floating around, it makes a big negative impact. It's more than the thing like issue of pollution. It's the issue of aesthetics. So hence it should be it should be just banned, and it is banned. However, like as I said, all the time, like government does not have eyes and ears throughout the banks. Everywhere. So wherever government is not looking, people are just coming and throwing things over. For example, one of my friend just 2 years back was visiting the Triveni Sangam at Allahabad, and it's considered as a very like kind of a very holy place where if the body is not burnt, it can be thrown and like you immediately go to heaven. In spite of all the like kind of all the measures, people staying around. So what happens, like under some people come in a boat and some kind of rug was there underneath under their feet, and nobody looked. In a speck of a second, something just dropped into the river. So what would you do with these things? So what government is thinking is like to have dedicated bodies to address these issues. So as I was talking about the Ganga task force, so it's just not local community people. Army is also tagged with them. So they have, like, if there is any violence or people just don't want to abide the rules, so then the army can take in and just like do whatever actions is necessary through the legal or administrative way. So these have started very recently, over 1 or 2 years, and we hope that these measures would expand and show its results in years to come. And lastly, about the periodic measurement, I suspect that the agencies, the respective agencies, they have it, but it's just when the reports come out, it's all aggregated. So with my limited knowledge, exposure and capacity, I have not been able to kind of got hold of these rigorous periodic measurements that must be taken throughout, because they have, at least along the Ganges basin, they have 300 to 400 measuring locations. So they must be taking it daily. So they have it with them, but it's and specifically regarding the Ganges, government is very sensitive about its water flow and other these kinds of parameters. So it's much of the information is classified, so it's not for public. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions from the audience? Okay.
My brief question to Mr. Dasgupta.
Yeah.
You talked about incentives and skill upgradation, capacity building and all these things. But you never mentioned about punitive action in very strong terms. when the people do not do about quality of the concerned stakeholders, do not adhere to the laws. Why the punitive action should also not be taken? This should also be included in your report.
Yeah, go on directly. Yes.
So means I because I don't agree that punitive action should be taken in that hard way. That's why I didn't mention it. I think if this exercise has to be sustainable, people will have to be brought on board, and to bring people on board, you might have to take some temporary punitive action, but it is not a sustainable way to ensure that a country as diverse and large and unequal as India is currently can be held to a stick, so to say. If many things were equal, if it was a much smaller geography, if the rule of law was evenly applied to all sections of society, then one would imagine that something punitive might be sustainable, but not necessarily. In our context, we are still quite far away from a situation like that. That's my opinion on this.
May I join the audience and ask a question to all three of you? Let's face it, Hinduism is a polluting religion. That you take your own filth and put it out, because then that makes you clean. You are a Bengali Maitreyee, so you would understand the Bengali expression, Bhager ma Ganga Pana. A mother with many children does not get the privilege of going to the Ganges when she dies, because everyone thinks it's the other people's responsibility to put the body in the Ganges. But the whole idea is that you have to put the body in the Ganges. And I had a little idealistic moment. I was back in Dhenkanal, my village, and I thought we should have toilets for people who live on our property. So I encouraged them with a bit of money and land to build toilets, only to realize that different castes had to have their different toilets, that no one would allow the untouchables to use their toilet. And then the question was, who will clean them? Who will clean the toilets of the upper castes? So the fact that Mr. Modi is leading this campaign, and yet he will not have a full frontal attack on those aspects of Hinduism which are downright opposed to the core policies, is a point not being made. I mean, let's face it. Again, to your point, Maitreyee, about marketization. I understand by marketization the idea of making anti-pollution policies financially attractive. Now, in China, human excreta could be sold as a fertilizer. Can you imagine that in India? But on the other hand, cow dung is used as a purifying device. I'm not sure about its medical values. So these are oddities that are germane to the religion. But in our enthusiasm about the whole campaign, one doesn't talk about these core issues. Dipinder, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, yeah. I did bring it up tangentially. I'll just reiterate the point and agree with what Shubhagato said in response to the earlier question. These behaviors are not immutable. They have changed in areas. I think the big gap lies in creating a very explicit awareness of the consequences of open defecation and what it does to yourself and to the children. And also the administrative part. You mentioned CLTS in areas where there's a clear demonstration of the risks and the benefits. It has worked. It's worked in Hindu societies. That's the reason why I deliberately picked on Nepal, which mirrors us in large measure. And they have made remarkable strides. So caste is a hurdle. It's not insurmountable, and beyond a point, it's somehow starts being used as a cop-out factor. There are more than subtle differences across areas over time. So I still, I think there's, coming from a policy bias, not an advocacy, I think there is progress, and personally, I see a lot of hope. The fact that this issue has been brought to the forefront, and the very serious efforts, including for me, it was an education hearing, Shubhagato and Maitreyee, the different policy initiatives, the different incentive structures, which I think is at the crux of the debate. How do you induce people to behave in a manner that's individually and socially desirable? So the short answer is its behaviors are not immutable. People, things do change, and they have indeed changed. And it's not just in India. And India is not, you should start looking at India as a unique. The other countries which have had similar problems, and they've bypassed and gone ahead and made remarkable progress.
I was only making a debater's point about Bangladesh being a Muslim country, or Mizoram, Kerala, Sikkim having large non-Hindu populations might have something to do with the way those communities organize themselves to fight this kind of pollution.
No, you're absolutely right, and there is data. For Muslim children, they're healthier, they live longer, and there's a difference of 1.7. This is scientifically computed. And the ghettoization, in a very twisted sense, socially it might be, has benefited because, fecal matter is one of the most contaminated in terms of microbes, and infant fecal matter is even worse, waste. But in isolated communities, isolated Muslim communities, it's even lower, the incidence of infections. Having said that, within Hindu communities, as I mentioned, in Uttar Pradesh and in Bihar, there are examples of certain districts which have done better than others. So I would seek recourse and IBM and policy.
If I could also respond to, I thought, a very interesting and provocative question is that, means it's other than the technical side and the policy side of it. There's also the political, economic aspect of it as to when leadership wants to make it an issue, and what it means for the politics of the vote bank. And I think it's a very complicated area. And I think some of this large transformation that the Prime Minister and the party seems to be, set their minds on, I think sanitation might have a central role in whatever is being called as this transformation that we are all trying to put our heads around.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I am being given a stern signal by Yusuf, who will cut off power in 5 minutes if I don't bring this to a close. So I'm going to, we'll continue the conversation over a cup of tea. I would like to very much. First and foremost, I would like to give away some tokens of our appreciation. This is our rule. We don't allow our guests to leave empty-handed. So you get the Oxford short introduction by Rahul, unless you have the copy already on reform. There you go.
Thank you so much.
And you, Shubhagato, you get Tantayong's book, Socio-Political and Economic Challenges in South Asia.
Thank you.
Okay. And family gets only thanks, so you get my heartfelt thanks. And as I bring it to a close, let me put it this way. No hyperbole from me. I'm a political scientist. I have worked on Indian politics, God knows for 40 years. Today, I saw for the first time how complex Swachh Bharat is. I don't know if Prime Minister Modi knew how complex the issues were when he thought he was picking on a non-divisive issue which will get good brand recognition. Of course, in India, we tend to get a bit cynical too early. And when you see the picture of the Prime Minister with spotlessly white clothes, holding a spotlessly clean broom, and being photographed with some fawning people around, it does make you feel a bit cynically about these endeavors. But today, to my satisfaction, the panel has shown what is underwater, how complex these issues are. And if I were to have the checklist, I was just after listening to you, sir, I'm already beginning my checklist. How to ban self-help. Everyone has a choice to spit there or not to spit. In government offices, it makes me laugh. यहाँ पे थूकना बना है, it's forbidden to spit here. That would be exactly the place we should get the maximum bombardment. और यहाँ पे पेशाब करना मना है near bus stands. They're like magnets. So you have a choice to do or not to do for individuals as well as bigger polluters, corporations, or temples, or restaurants. So why not criminalize it? Our Shubhagato, you can see he works in Delhi, not in Singapore. He's much more lenient towards potential criminals. What did he say? If rule of law is applied uniformly, then I'll criminalize pollution. You know, toilet training starts in very early childhood. And toilet training is a painful activity. I mean, to train yourself to hold yourself. Little babies do it all over the place. But all mothers know how to toilet train their children. So why not toilet train adults? So I would not be, maybe I've lived in Singapore too long now. Well, I live in Germany otherwise. One can think of the stern hands of law as certainly one of my three major variables. That's order. But then order, welfare, identity are the three variables I use. Everyone is a potential, I mean, if you're driving, everyone would want to get there quickly. But if all try to get there quickly, no one gets there at all because there is a jam. So that's what I mean. Of course, I take your point. One can't have as many policemen as men, and if one did, who will police the police? So ultimately, it falls back on education or self-policing. But let's not take policing off the agenda. My next item on my agenda is welfare. You have to have toilets. I mean, that's one nice thing about Singapore. Every mall, every floor would have toilets, and they're kept reasonably clean. So, if there's a need and need is fulfilled, then one can expect people to wait until the next toilet, or a little sign that in 5 minutes you'll be reaching a toilet. So these are the kind of technical connectivity between the individual decision to do it or not do it. And I would now go to the whole idea of promoting anti-pollution to a value. Now, how many people have seen the pictures of Jamuna after Deepavali or after Durga Puja immersions and those goddesses looking like they're skeletons? It's wretched. And people foraging among them. So why not find some other way of saying goodbye to the goddess? Or for that matter, Delhi's air. I mean, why must we feed the Chinese industry, Chinese fireworks industry, and pollute Delhi? I mean, there are people, smart people in Delhi who complain about it. Mr. Chandaria has a solution.
Talking about China, I echo to one thing, that we want to make our country big and popular. Popular means in systematic way they can work properly and get it. It was a dictatorship. At the moment we said it is a dictatorship. But today when I read about the new new meetings and other things which are going on, they say we want to make our country big, that we have to understand that we are Chinese, we are going to do the things the way we want to do. If we do the same thing, then we can do it without hurting anything. But see, cleanliness is one thing we have to clean. And that even at my home, my maid was doing this thing. And I showed her, notice to this. Now the thing which used to take her about 3 hours or 2 hours, she can do it within 20 minutes.
Mrs. Chandra, we will continue this conversation. I would simply argue that Mr. Modi should be listening to you in order for him to pass the idea on to the Rashtriya Shamsevak Sangh or the BJP party workers, rather than overloading the government servants into cleaning up India. The Chinese work because the party takes it up. Where there is a communal or community attempt at fighting these public bats, as I call them, they are more successful. But a civil servant working for his pension, anxious not to violate any rules, is probably not the best implementer. I will bring my list to a close because I'm getting turn signals. We now have to talk a little about, this is Singapore and I run a think tank, and we are always concerned about how much money is spent and what comes out of it. So what I can assure the audience out of this, because I feel very, very happy, very grateful for the 3 wonderful papers, is for me to ask Shubhagato, or for that matter Dipinder or Maitreyee, to see if you could get a paper on air pollution, because then I can publish a symposium volume of 4 insight papers, the 3 that have been presented, and we must talk a little about, just like you have talked about river pollution, air pollution. That would be a very nice set of 4 papers to be published as one package. And for you, Maitreyee, you have added one more element to my list as to why it matters to ISAS, because ISAS must look at trade and industry, economy, we have talked about the cost of pollution, governance, you have talked about what can be done to promote, and international relations. Look, Maitreyee, if you are talking about river pollution, how about countries which are downstream? If the rivers get polluted upstream, the downstream folks like Bangladesh get it from, or Pakistan will get it from us, from India, because of Indus water. Or in other words, thanks to your presentation, I will now argue that pollution is also not just a national issue, but an international issue, a regional issue in South Asia. So if I were to write a short introduction to the symposium volume of 4 insight papers, I will certainly take up the idea of the checklist, and I would say pollution is something which affects our agenda across the board. So to make this possible, it would not have been possible without the excellent presentation by my colleague, Dr. Dipinder, my colleague, half-colleague, Shubhagato, and my future colleague, Maitreyee. Thank you very much. And no event without an audience, so I would like to thank the audience for giving up their time and engaging us in this wonderful conversation. Please stay and continue the conversation over a cup of tea. Thank you all. Thank you.